I don't know where the camera is, but welcome. We're excited to have you all here today. I hope you guys enjoyed this couple of speakers that we brought in, Sarah Nelson and Sarah Kostelik, going to talk to us a bit about some background in child welfare and really looking at a Native American voice in that field and what that could look like and what does look like out there right now. Just one thing from our funders, have a grant that helps support this event here. That's through HRSA that is able to bring our students here, bring our speakers here, and really provide some funding for some of our students doing work out there in the social work in the Native American field out there in the world. But just thank you to them. But I'm going to introduce our first speaker here. It's going to be Sarah M. Nelson. She's an LMSW and MPH, Masters of Social Work and Public Health, is a Tribal Child Welfare Policy Associate at the University of Southern Maine and serves as the co-director for the National Tribal Child Welfare Center for Innovation and Advancement. Sarah previously managed the development and delivery of resources for tribal child welfare professionals as Universal Service Manager for the Capacity Building Center for Tribes and has directed services and community programs at the Denver Indian Family Health Resource Center. She holds a Master of Social Work and Master of Public Health degrees from the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis. That's us. Sarah is an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa and resides in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. She is descendant of a survivor of the Baraga Chippewa boarding and day school and works in dedication to the resilience of her family and community. Welcome, Sarah.
Miigwech, Bonjour. Hi, everyone. I'm going to have a seat. Okay. It's great to see you all today, and thank you all for having me here. My name is Sarah Nelson, and I am an alum of this program, of the MSW-MPH program. I was a Booter Scholar, and I graduated from the program in 2012. So it's been a minute since I've been on campus, and it's crazy to see how different it is. It's beautiful. It's just like, I can't remember if that building was there or not. So my brain is trying to create a map. But it's wonderful to be back. And so today I'm going to be talking about a couple different things. One of them is going to be myself in the context of child welfare and in the context of being a student and a graduate of this program and what it looks like to work in child welfare 10 years after leaving this program, what I wish I knew when I was a student, what I wish I had done, and what I'm really grateful I had done too. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the landscape of child welfare in what I've been seeing in my work. And so, quick disclaimer that I like to provide, these are my own perspectives completely, not the perspectives of my employer or the funders of my project. I do also want to share that a small trigger warning that there may be some subjects that I talk about that are difficult, including suicide, gun violence, and systemic trauma and intergenerational trauma, excuse me. So just sharing that. I hope everyone takes care of themselves today. If there's something that you'd like to talk to me about or you have questions about after that you don't feel comfortable sharing in this space, I am available afterwards. So, all right, that's all the disclaimers. So, I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And so if you're familiar, Michigan has two peninsulas. And so there's one where almost everybody lives. 97% of Michigan's population lives in the Lower Peninsula. Michiganders love to do the hands. And so in the Lower Peninsula, the majority of the population resides. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula, where about 3% of Michigan's population is, but it's still a third of Michigan's land. Incredibly rural. I just recently moved back to the hometown that I am from, and it's been super fantastic. I'll go into that later. But where I grew up was very, very rural. I did not grow up on the reservation. I grew up very close to the reservation that our tribal members have. But I grew up in a small trailer on top of really a pile of uranium, actually. It's pretty crazy. So we have a lot of mining back home. Mining is huge in terms of iron ore, nickel, sulfide. And with that comes a lot of responsibility of those businesses and corporations. And as I was growing up, my dad was our local gravedigger. He buried over, I think, half of the population that is in our hometown cemetery. And so I grew up from pretty humble means. My mom was a teen mom, and she had me when she was 16 and made a decision to be a first-generation college student and go to college when I had gotten to kindergarten. And so I was surrounded by learning, I was surrounded by nature, and I was surrounded by my community. And I never once in my younger years thought I would go into social work, and I never thought I would go into child welfare as a field, and here I am. 10 years after leaving this program, that's really what I've done since. But growing up in Michigan, I started to look at programs that were related more to health. I was watching my family have different outcomes than other families, and I didn't understand why. And it took a lot of learning and reflection, and really, I mean, every day, learning and reflecting to understand the trauma and the intergenerational challenges that my family was not healing from. And I watched cycles of violence, and I watched cycles of substance use in my family directly. And that was our norm. I mean, it's how we grew up. I never felt like I was unsafe, but I often think back, having been a caseworker, that there were many times where had somebody come to our house, I would have been removed. I was in a situation where my parents kept me safe, but they had a lot of parties at our house. And when they did, I loved hanging out with everyone. But I saw friends of mine too that had family members that that also partied, and I watched those children sometimes get in situations where I didn't see them again. They were removed sometimes and didn't come back to school, and I watched this happen to my friends, and I watched. It was difficult, I think, going through high school and seeing more of the challenges that our community was experiencing start to play out in my friends who were now abusing substances and were trying to escape from some of the challenges that they were experiencing back home. And so, got through high school. I made a decision to go to college to be a pre-med student. And very quickly, I changed my major. So I was in that field for maybe one semester. And then organic chemistry and physics and all those classes happened. And I said, you know what? No, thanks. So I made a decision to transition over to psychology. And the school I went to was a technical school. And I ended up getting really connected with things like ergonomics, like how do we sit in our chair and how does that impact our psyche at the end of the day? Really strange things that I don't research now and I think are cool. But as I got into that field, I started getting more into physical health as well. So kind of getting back since I had lost the pre-med piece. And in that transition, I started to notice just how much our physical health was supporting our general well-being, which sounds very, as I say that, it sounds very obvious. But truly, as I was going through these programs, recognizing the value of putting health as a forefront in our communities. And I started to get really excited about things like health promotion and public health and health education and looking into different models because I didn't know what I was thinking or seeing or experiencing other than just people were doing better when they were thinking about their health. And I ended up becoming a certified personal trainer for a while. I worked for the census. I taught Spanish classes in a 2-room schoolhouse in the middle of nowhere and was just trying to figure it out. And then I started working with the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. Um, it is a neighboring tribe from where I'm at. And I started working with community members and just offering some free personal training sessions. It was not a lot, it was maybe 2 hours of my time a week. And I ended up having a very small but very motivated group of women that would meet with me every week. And I felt so inspired by working with these women and seeing just how this 1 hour with them a week was really supporting so many other areas of their life. And I was like, I don't know, I feel like I should do something with this. So then I started looking at public health programs. And a long, long time ago, I took a road trip through St. Louis. And I drove by WashU and I was like, wow, look at that school. And again, my mom was a first generation college student. There was not a lot of pushing for education when I was growing up. It was, you're going to go to school. That's it. Good luck. And so financially, there wasn't a lot of support. There was support in terms of you're going to do it, and that's the expectation, but not a whole lot beyond that. And so when I drove by the school, I was like, wow, that's a really cool school. I've never seen anything like that. And over the years, as I was in college, I never forgot about WashU. And so when I was looking at graduate programs, WashU had a brand new Masters of Public Health. And so I made a decision to apply to that program and 9 other public health programs because I was terrified I wouldn't get in because it was WashU. I got into all the programs, so good problem to have. I had 10 schools sitting in front of me. Which one am I going to pick? All over the country. I had never been anywhere. And so I ended up deciding on WashU. And the factor really was the public health and social work dual degree alongside the Booter Center and the support that that program offered. And it was in that program and in my transition to coming to the Brown School that I really recognized the alignment with public health and with considering child welfare as public health. And it all kind of, once I got here, it made perfect sense. But until I got here, it did not. And when I was here, I was a newer student in, so the MPH program was new. So dual degree was brand new, trying to figure out what our what our concentration practicum and foundation practicum looked like and how those aligned with this program was complicated. And then adding the additional requirements for the Booter Scholarship as well, there was a lot going on. And then I decided to work almost full-time on top of that. But I worked at the Health Communications Research Lab, and I got to do some really exciting work with Matt Kruder, where we were looking at cigarette warning labels and how folks were responding to that in tribal communities as well as in rural communities. And so I got an opportunity my last summer in St. Louis to go all over the Midwest to different powwows and to recruit folks for these studies. I also had an opportunity, non-tribal related, but to go to almost every county in the state of Missouri and do recruitment for that study as well. And those little projects and being able to support this work and to be out in the community as a student and get that exposure was so pivotal for me in really feeling that I needed to go more in a macro direction. And I really felt just this deep connection of I want to be talking with people and working with people who are in the community every day. I might not be that person who is there every day, just recognizing my context, but I want to be the person that can support folks in that role. And so as I was going through the program, I learned about an organization in Denver called Denver Indian Family Resource Center. Phyllis Big Pond, who was an alum of this program, was the founder of that organization. And it still exists today. And so DIFRAC, as it's called, provides services to American Indian and Alaska Native families in the Denver metro area that are involved with or at risk for involvement with the child welfare system. And so I learned about this just a little bit in one of my classes. Someone had mentioned the name, and I never forgot that name. And so it sat in the back of my head, it rattled around. And then I found myself living in the state of Texas after I graduated. And I'm from Michigan, so it was very far from where I'm from. But I followed a partner there and lived on the border and decided to do child protective services. I was like, let's see what this is like. And it was crazy. It was incredibly difficult from my second week. First week, they kind of just kept me in the office. But the second week, it was a lot. And I don't think anything in school can really prepare you for what you see when you get into a field and when you get into an organization with folks who have been there for 15 plus years. I was the only person that was at our unit that just came out of school. I had no experience at all. And I was basically starting, I had never done casework before. So I was terrified. And I learned a lot. I went through the basic skills program. When I did my interview, I was told I would support ICWA cases. Come to find out, at that time, I can't speak for now, but at that time, I had found that the majority of ICWA cases in the state of Texas are typically transitioned to somebody that's in Austin. So if you think of the size of Texas, it's pretty large. And so if you think of a child that is 8-9 hours away from their primary caseworker that is trying to uphold ICWA and support that child, I was appalled. And so I felt so much in my training and so much from those staff that had been there for years, this push of don't ask if they're Native. Let's not make this an ICWA case. And I struggled. I really struggled in that role. And I made a decision after about a year to look at jobs at Denver Indian Family Resource Center. And one came across my email one day. I applied, and I applied for a job in the state of Hawaii. And I happened to get them both on the same day. But I had never been to Colorado. I had never been to Hawaii. And I said, you know what? Let's go to Colorado. Let's see what that's like. And part of the reason was when you go to Hawaii, you have to quarantine your animals for a couple months. So the cats, I decided on Denver. So I moved to Denver. I had never been there before. I get there, and I'm a case manager working with Native families that are in Denver. Denver was a relocation site, so there are a number of cities across the country that are considered relocation cities, and Denver was one of them. There was a large push for folks to move there, I believe, in the 60s in particular, for Native folks. And so there are a lot of Native families there. And there are a lot of Native families that end up there as well, too. When you think of the proximity and where it is, geographically, Colorado and Denver is kind of right in a hot spot of where a lot of powwows are happening, where ceremony is happening. And as folks are traveling, sometimes they get in bad situations or they're running from something too. And so there were a lot of families that we worked with at DIFRAC when I was there. We served at roughly 600 families a year. And that was services beyond referral, but truly case management services, community-based services, and we would do court advocacy as well. So when there were children and families that were involved with the Denver County system or, excuse me, any of the other county systems in the area, our team would come in and we'd be invited to work directly with that family as a liaison and support to ensure that the ICWA higher standards were being held. And sorry, lost my train of thought. I will say with that role, so at the time, DIFRAC was doing research on an urban Indian child welfare practice model. I encourage everyone to check that out. It was developed by Nancy Lucero and Bree Bussey. And this model, we were testing it essentially at the time. We received some grant funding, and the goal was to improve outcomes for families, right? Particularly families who had a child under the age of 5. And so our team would get involved. We'd provide wraparound services, case management, like I said, court advocacy, and then also we would do everything we could to get families connected with at least one of our community programs to build connection with them in the community. That was really big for us. I very quickly got moved into a leadership role at the organization, and then moved into a deputy director role not too long after. And so I had an opportunity to manage our grants as well as do a lot of our development and grant writing. And for me, that was an area where I felt like there was such an opportunity for us to look at what are the gaps in our service and what areas of funding can we find that support that. And we did a very strategic process of looking through and considering all of the wraparound services that Native families might need in a case management scenario or where they are involved with a system or at risk. And so we did a long couple week-long process where we were bringing folks together, and then we started doing focus groups with the community as well. And as we were doing that, we began to develop new resources that were for Native families, particularly for urban Native families. Oftentimes when we provide resources to families, when we're working individually with tribal programs, in my role currently, we support them in creating those resources. But when we're working with programs that provide services across all Native groups, not just one specific tribe, we really wanted to be intentional with making sure any resources we had that we were doing our best to ensure that they're culturally responsive to a very broad Native audience. And that's difficult. I can tell you in my current role, we develop resources for tribal child welfare professionals. And a lot of our work is ensuring that the language that we're using is meaningful across all Native groups as much as possible. So we really try to have an emphasis in our language, in our marketing, and how we're trying to communicate with folks. And so at DIFRAC, not sure what else I can share at this point. I ended up leaving that position at a point when I was with my partner in Texas, and he had followed me to Colorado, and he died by suicide when I was at DIFRAC. And during that time, I have to say that the support of the agency was just incredible. But because of what was going on in Denver, I made a decision to leave. And that was one of the hardest decisions I've made. I ended up going to Las Vegas, and I worked for a different nonprofit doing after-school programming. Did that for a few years, had a great time. I missed tribal child welfare more than anything. I was always looking at positions. I was thinking about what did I not get to finish in this last role, or what could I do that could potentially build off of that? And I had an opportunity to work with the Capacity Building Center for Tribes project for a number of years. And so I had a couple different roles on that project, but essentially the Center for Tribes provided technical assistance to tribal child welfare programs across the country. And so we would provide direct TA where we would go out in communities and work directly with programs to do practice mapping or to develop policy and procedure or to support the tribal workforce. So we would work directly with leadership of these programs and then also work with their workforce too. We had an opportunity with my team. So we provide, we have a website called the Tribal Information Exchange that has over 600 resources for tribal child welfare professionals. And so our team develops the resources that are on that page. And we recently were awarded the National Tribal Child Welfare Center for Innovation and Advancement, and the Booter Center will be the evaluator for that project too, which is really fantastic. But that is basically the next step of the Center for Tribes is that we are looking at all of these years of work of myself and everyone on our project coming together and being able to offer these services to tribal child welfare programs. And so, I'm going to pause for a second because I have talked nonstop. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts? Okay, cool. I can talk. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I skipped right over that part. So when we were working with focus groups, we did 3 focus groups in that process. We met with youth. Primarily it was youth around teenage age, about 10 to 16. But we also met with our younger kiddos in a different session. A lot of younger kiddos came with their parents to the parent guardian session. And then we had an elder session. And we learned so much from every single person that engaged in those processes. We heard a lot about, I'll just speak for my experience of what I know of Denver at least 10 years ago. There are a number of organizations in the Denver metro area that provide services to Native families. And what the families were telling us is they didn't know about the services, or when they would go to see someone, they would, the provider would ask the family to try to understand the services, more so than the providers connecting with the Native organizations. And so we developed a collaborative process as a result of this. It was a monthly group. We called it the 7 Stars Collaborative. Um, it, and we met, like I said, once a month with roughly 50 organizations across the Denver metro area. And our first meeting that we held, we didn't know how many folks would attend. And about 10 or 15 orgs did. And we marketed it as we want to ensure that service providers in Denver have a baseline understanding of Native people, of Indigenous culture, and of the history of Native people in the Denver area. And so that was our first goal. Our second goal was to ensure that that these service providers knew what resources were available for Native families. And so we would, every month, someone from our organization would do just a 5-10 minute short kind of training, but just enough to get folks excited and have conversation and think about things perhaps a little bit different. And then we would allow a space for our providers to come in and have a conversation with us about their services. And if they had anything specific for Native families, they would emphasize that. It ended up becoming a space where Like I said, we had almost 50 or 60 organizations that were participating after about a year. It was, I think, really successful because it wasn't happening before, and it felt like a lot of providers were afraid to share the wrong resource or say the wrong thing. And so our group, when we're thinking about having that native voice, sometimes having that native voice is opening that door and not saying anything, and giving others that voice. And I think being able to open those spaces up for folks where they feel safe to ask questions or to build their understanding is critical. And that was, I think, one of the big things that we saw was um, a lot of our families after that, like we had a directory that we put together, and a lot of our families, I think, felt more supported as a result of that. But in urban areas, it's tricky. And the transience is tricky too. Like I said, there's people coming and going. And so it can be really difficult to assess how effective services are in a lot of these cases. So, yeah, no problem.
So one of the main like aims of ICWA is to keep the children at least within the tribal family or, things like that. So I'm curious, when you were talking about the Texas, issue, you're relocating these children way, way far away. How are you keeping them connected to their family, or how are you working to get them back to a family member or back to a tribal member or elder? How does that work when you're that far away?
It doesn't work when it's that far away. I mean, I will just share my own perspective and opinion, but so when you think about systems like that, where they are removing children, Native children, and the children are not necessarily being placed that far away, but their primary worker is perhaps several hours away from them. When you have situations like that, I am guessing, just based off of how large my caseload was, that the caseload for those ICWA workers that are in Austin at that time was substantial. And so for those caseworkers to be able to develop a relationship with that child and to be able to effectively ensure active efforts that that child is being connected with their culture if they're not with family, it's really difficult. And so I don't think it can happen in that model. I mean, maybe, but that's not how I would recommend doing it.
Thank you, Sarah. We will have more questions here in a few for you for sure. But we will get to that in a few. We will now introduce our next speaker, Sarah Kostelik. Dr. Kostelik is an enrolled citizen of the native village of Uzinki and became the executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, NICWA, in January 2015. Prior to joining NICWA as chief of staff in 2011, Sarah led the National Congress of American Indian, NCAI, Welfare Reform Program, and in 2003 was the founding director of NCAI's Policy Research Center. She began her career at the Bureau of Indian Affairs Central Office as a child welfare specialist in 1998. She earned a master's degree and PhD from the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis, where she serves as an adjunct faculty, also here at WashU. Sarah has served as principal investigator of several national federally and privately funded research projects, partnering with tribal and urban Indian communities. She has authored numerous publications, including journal articles, book chapters, and curricula. She is a member of the boards of directors of BoardSource, Generations United, and the Native Ways Federation. Sarah enjoys being an auntie to her 5 nieces and nephews, reading, hiking, and kayaking. Welcome, Dr. Kostelik.
Chamai, thank you. I'm really happy to be here with you this afternoon, and it's a real honor to come back to the Brown School and to have this time with you. Like Sarah, I didn't imagine I would grow up to be a social worker. I didn't know any social workers. I didn't know social work was a discipline. But I think I ended up on this path to social work because as a young person, my Alutiiq father always told me, when we need help, we help other people. And in the process of doing that, we always find the help that we need. And so, although nobody used the word social work, in my view, social work is about serving one another, and in the process of doing that, getting the things that we need to. I really appreciate Sarah. This is the first time I've ever met Sarah. We were here at the Brown School lots of years apart, but I really appreciate, Sarah, how you kind of talked about your work at the local level in tribal and urban places, and then kind of zoomed out to the national level to talk about what that work looked like and the relationship between those two different kinds of work and what your learning journey was that helped you to be so effective in those roles. So I want to express my gratitude to you for the important work that you do every day, and for your willingness to share so much of yourself and your story with us here today. So Koyana, Sarah, I really appreciate that. My career in social work has been at the national level. So I finished my MSW here in 1997 and went to Washington, D.C. after doing a practicum there, and worked for the federal government briefly, and then for a national advocacy organization, the National Congress of American Indians, and then came back to do a PhD. And it took me a long time, but I finally finished in 2008. I graduated then. So I'm happy to talk with you a little bit today about the work that I'm doing at the national level. So in the time that I have, I'm going to cover 5 things. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the place that I work, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, or NICWA, as we call it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a 2003 U.S. Supreme Court decision called Holland v. Brackeen that upheld the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a process that my organization has been on for the last year and a half to formulate ICWA 2050, which is a national framework with 2 goals. First, to strengthen tribal child welfare capacity, and second, to strengthen ICWA implementation and compliance. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about this ICWA 2050 plan that just rolled out today on social media and on our website. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the goals and priorities of this new national plan, and specifically to mention some roles that advocates can play. So I'll start with where I work with the National Indian Child Welfare Association and tell you a little bit about our organization. So NICWA is a 40-year-old Native-led nonprofit that's headquartered in Portland, Oregon. And our mission is to protect the safety, health, and cultural identity of all Native children and families today and for future generations by upholding culturally based services, community strengths, and tribal sovereignty. Our vision is that all Native children and their families are safe, healthy, and belong to strong communities that are culturally and spiritually abundant. We're a membership association of tribal nations, of organizations that serve American Indian and Alaska Native kids and families, like DIFRAC, the organization that Sarah was talking about. And we also have individual advocates that are members of our organization. So they may be service providers, foster parents, students, a whole range of individuals. So at NICWA, we accomplish our mission using 5 core strategies to help tribal nations build their capacity to deliver effective culturally based services to keep kids safe, to keep kids with their families, keep families intact and together whenever that's possible, and to promote healing, community healing, family healing, often leaning into our cultures as the single greatest resource we have for helping families. Our strategies include these 5 things: raising awareness and advocacy, 2, promoting culturally grounded and Native-led approaches, 3, strengthening national, state, and tribal policy, 4th, building the field and learning together, and 5th, educating with information and resources. Our impact is felt at multiple levels, at the national level, at the community level, at the family level, and at the individual child or youth level. So at the national level, we uphold and we advocate for child welfare practice, policy, and resource allocation that's rooted in cultural identity, equity, and tribal sovereignty. At the community level, we follow the leadership of tribal nations, and in collaboration with public and private sector partners, we strengthen and nurture community-based solutions and services. At the family level, we support families who are raising Native children by valuing family integrity, by keeping families together, and by ensuring access to culturally based services. And finally, at the child and youth level, we draw on ancestral wisdom, thousands of years of aggregated knowledge and experience to create conditions for strong and stable nurturing networks wherever Native children and youth grow up. Since our inception 40 years ago, a core piece of our public policy agenda has been to protect the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, a 46-year-old federal law, and to strengthen state implementation and compliance with that law. In 2017, the state of Texas sued the federal government, citing ICWA was unconstitutional on several grounds. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court in 2022, it was known as Holland v. Brackeen. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes now talking to you about ICWA, what it is and what it does, about that case, Holland v. Brackeen, what was at stake in that case, and the Supreme Court's decision in 2023. The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978 as a direct response to centuries of assimilationist policies and practices. ICWA is a restorative law. It's intended to correct historical harms to American Indian and Alaska Native children and their families by establishing minimum standards that states must meet before removing Native children from their families under suspicion of abuse or neglect. Despite its longevity, ICWA is not well understood, and it's often circumvented or misapplied. In the US, there's a general lack of knowledge about Native peoples and tribal nations, and when you couple that with our national lack of knowledge about the child welfare system, we come to an issue that is very poorly understood. How Native families and kids, how their communities intersect with the child welfare system, what our experiences have been. Even many judges and state caseworkers who are responsible for implementing the law are ignorant of it, of its requirements, and especially of social work best practices for implementing the spirit of the law. In 1978, which was in my lifetime, so this isn't ancient history, in 1978, ICWA was passed to halt the forced, unnecessary removal of Native children from their families, which at the time was widespread and generally accepted practice. A 1976 study by the Association on American Indian Affairs documented that a quarter to a third of all Native children were removed from their families, most frequently because non-Native social workers judged Native families by Western standards. So if you think about that, that is a staggering number. A quarter to a third of all Native children removed from their families. Social workers at the time asserted that living in traditional homes without electricity or running water was neglect. They felt children supervised by older siblings or cousins, while adults conducted subsistence activities to feed and clothe their families, meant that children were neglected and in danger. They removed children because of family and community poverty. 85% of Native children who were removed were placed in non-Native homes, a foreign environment, which was the exact opposite of popular policies at the time that emphasized race matching in out-of-home placements. These practices accelerating in the 1960s and 70s on the heels of the federal Indian boarding school policies, which for 150 years perpetuated harm by removing generations of Native children from their families to government and church-run residential schools. When the general public learned about the widespread mistreatment and abuse that was happening in boarding schools, and they began to fall out of favor, eventually to be defunded, the public child welfare system took up the task of forced family separation where the education system left off. To put this in a larger context, at NICWA, when we talk about the history of federal Indian policy, when we talk about these assimilationist policies, we put this in a global context. We talk about the recipe for colonization, recipe, certain number of ingredients, things you do in a certain order. We talk about the recipe for colonization that is the same the world over. This is actually a recipe that has been replicated in continent after continent, in country after country. And so the recipe for colonization is first to take the land. Second, you have to control the natural resources, especially water. Third, you supplant indigenous forms of governance. Whatever forms of governance there were before are invalid, they don't make sense. Replace them with Western models of governance. The fourth ingredient is to delegitimize indigenous thought, worldview, values, teachings, to denigrate these things, to make them seem savage and barbaric and backwards, inhuman. And the last and final ingredient of this recipe is to take the children. And this is absolutely intentional, because taking the children severs the process of socialization. It prevents children from growing up knowing who they are. knowing who they're part of, knowing they're part of something bigger than themselves. And so this process, the boarding schools, public child welfare system, all of this removal is part of this intentional recipe for colonization that continues to be replicated in the systems, in the resource allocation, in the programs that we have today. When ICWA was passed at the urging of tribal leaders from across the country who are watching their communities shrink and disappear before their very eyes, ICWA was an anomaly. It was intentionally different than other federal child welfare policies of its time. And interestingly enough, in the decades since its passage, we've seen federal child welfare policy move towards alignment with ICWA. So the rest of federal child welfare policy has moved towards the requirements of ICWA, the protections of ICWA. In fact, ICWA is widely known as the gold standard of child welfare policy and practice. That's because it emphasizes family preservation, active efforts to keep families together or to reunify them. And it emphasizes out-of-home placement with extended family and within community and culture if kids can't stay safely at home. ICWA also recognizes tribal sovereignty and the authority of tribal nations to self-govern and to be involved in the lives of their citizens. ICWA ensures that tribal nations have a say in determining what's in the best interest of their citizen children when they're involved in a child custody proceeding. State cases can even be transferred to tribal courts where tribes themselves can exercise their jurisdiction. So why would a law requiring best practices that reduce the trauma of vulnerable children removed from their homes come under attack? In 2017, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton sued the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior, alleging that ICWA was unconstitutional on several grounds. He filed in federal district court in the Northern District of Texas. Several days later, he was joined in that suit by a handful of non-native foster parents, including the Brackeens, who wanted to adopt native children that they were fostering. These families were represented pro bono by attorneys from a global law firm called Gibson Dunn. 5 tribal nations intervened in this case, became parties in the case to defend ICWA: the Cherokee Nation, Morongo Band of Mission Indians, the Navajo Nation, Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and the Quinault Indian Nation. This case worked its way through the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In November 22, the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the case. The plaintiffs argued that ICWA was unconstitutional on several grounds, including that Congress lacked the plenary authority to pass the law in the first place, that Congress exceeded their authority. They didn't have the authority to pass a law like this. The plaintiffs also argued that the law unlawfully commandeers or forces state agencies to carry out federal responsibilities. And most dangerously, they claimed that ICWA violates the Equal Protection Amendment by discriminating against Native kids based on race. Nothing could be further from the truth. ICWA isn't based on race. It only applies to a subset of Native kids, kids who are members of a federally recognized tribe or who are eligible for membership and have a biological parent who's a member of the tribe. So the protections of ICWA are based on tribal citizenship, the relationship of a tribal nation to its citizen. The equal protection claim is dangerous because if a court would buy that argument, it would set a precedent that could then be applied to other laws, It could call into question all of federal Indian law, hundreds of years of established law governing the relationship between the federal government, tribal governments, and their citizens. And we know that this was really the far-reaching intent of the case. As attorneys in this case, the same attorneys have already filed other lawsuits making similar claims. In 2022, Gibson Dunn attorneys made identical constitutional claims about another federal law, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. So this is a Ninth Circuit case, Maverick Gaming LLC v. United States. And in that case, it was argued that Washington state compacts with tribal nations for sports betting were unconstitutional. So this gaming industry firm was trying to challenge federal law, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, and making these same kinds of claims about why the law was unconstitutional. So we know that anti-tribal interests have a much bigger agenda than ICWA. They're really about dismantling tribal sovereignty to advance state and private rights. In June 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a 7-2 decision that ICWA was constitutional. ICWA was upheld in its entirety. All of the opponents' claims were rejected. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, an adoptive mom, wrote for the majority. She was joined by Chief Justice Roberts and Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Jackson. The majority rejected all of the opponents' claims, most based on the merits of the case, that is, legal analysis determining that the claims were false, and one claim, the equal protection claim, based on lack of standing. That is, that the plaintiffs in the case don't have the right to bring the claim because they weren't directly harmed by ICWA, and the Supreme Court couldn't give them relief, wouldn't be able to remedy their personal situation anyway. In a full-throated defense of sovereignty, the court held that Congress has broad authority to legislate for the benefit of Indian tribes and individual Indians, and that none of ICWA's provisions violate the 10th Amendment's prohibition against commandeering, so ICWA doesn't unlawfully interfere with states' rights to regulate child welfare. The court rejected the claim that ICWA discriminates on the basis of race, finding that none of the challengers, the state of Texas or the non-native foster parents, had the standing to bring the claim. So the equal protection argument is still out there, still unaddressed by the court. And I would mention, for those of you who are interested in more information about this history of federal Indian policy and its impact on families and kids, that Justice Gorsuch wrote a beautiful concurrence in this case that really documents the history of federal involvement in the lives of Indian children. So it's a really sobering history lesson and really well written. While this case has come to an end, the fight for ICWA is far from over. The opponents swiftly affirmed that they intend to continue to bring cases that attack ICWA, especially cases that raise the equal protection challenge. And indeed, they have done that. There is, in fact, a case pending before the Minnesota Supreme Court right now that raises this very claim. While the Brackeen case was a win for Native kids and families, for Indian country, and I would argue for child advocates generally, because it affirmed that the federal government most certainly has a role in child welfare and ensuring the well-being of kids, we can't just wait for the next case. At the beginning of this case, Indian country organized through the Protect ICWA campaign and through many other vehicles to defend ICWA. The Protect ICWA campaign is a coalition of 4 national Native organizations who are working to defend ICWA through litigation, through federal and state policy, and public education and communications. So these partners are NICWA, our organization, the Native American Rights Fund, the National Congress of American Indians, and the Association on American Indian Affairs. So these organizations pursue these strategies, this what I call 3-legged stool, the litigation, federal and state policy, and communications pieces, pursue these strategies and helped to build a really broad base of support for ICWA, the bench of support that we saw in the Brackeen case. And so I would just point out that one example of this overwhelming support for ICWA was the 21 pro-ICWA amicus briefs that were filed at the Supreme Court level. So in that process, nearly 500 tribes and 60 Native organizations voiced their support for ICWA. 87 members of Congress, 23 states, both red and blue states. This was a bipartisan effort by members of Congress, by states, to support ICWA. Parent attorneys in 8 states filed a brief. Former foster youth filed a brief. The American Bar Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Medical Association, all of these groups filed briefs in support of the Indian Child Welfare Act. 27 national child advocacy organizations wrote a brief in support of ICWA, citing ICWA as the gold standard. So there's overwhelming support for ICWA in this case, as opposed to 3 anti-ICWA briefs filed on the opposite side. So Brackeen was a resounding victory, but advocates are working now to not only vigilantly monitor the ongoing attacks that we continue to see in the courts, but to also proactively translate our momentum from a very successful case outcome into strengthening ICWA implementation and compliance. My board of directors said, "Sarah, we've got to press the gas pedal all the way to the floor." So we have done this through a plan that we're rolling out nationally today on social media in honor of ICWA's anniversary tomorrow. To develop this emboldened long-term advocacy agenda in the wake of the Brackeen decision, NICWA engaged elected and appointed tribal leaders and tribal child welfare directors through a series of 11 listening sessions across the country between October 2023 and May of 2024. We partnered with the National Congress of American Indians and with many regional intertribal organizations, so organizations like the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, the United South and Eastern Tribes, the Alaska Federation of Natives. So we worked with these organizations to gather input about the needs and priorities of tribal leaders. And from these listening sessions, we had clear themes and directions for future work to strengthen ICWA implementation and compliance. And these themes fell into 4 general categories. First, to improve tribal capacity and to support tribal best practices, both on the Child Welfare Agency side and on the court side. Second, to strengthen tribal-state relationships, policy, and practice in child welfare. Third, to enhance tribal-federal partnerships in child welfare and gather data to be able to hold states accountable. And fourth, to improve public education and media about ICWA as the gold standard of child welfare policy and about the criticality of tribal sovereignty in child welfare to ensure better outcomes for tribal children. Our engagement process through these listening sessions and through ongoing discussions with our partners has been invaluable for the development of what we are calling ICWA 2050, which is our agenda for the next generation of advocacy for Native children and tribal sovereignty by building tribal child welfare capacity and strengthening ICWA implementation and compliance. ICWA 2050 is a set of principles with many expressions. It's a uniting vision spanning decades and sectors. It's a commitment to a future where Native children are woven back into the fabric of our cultures with care and intention. It inspires us to work together and with determination. For years, Native child welfare advocates and practitioners have been forced by limited resources and draining challenges to operate in the short term. What can be done this year or in this moment? But systems transformation requires long-mindedness. Our most pressing challenge and greatest opportunity right now is to work together toward a future that stretches beyond our lifetimes. 25 years is a generation. Starting in 2025, in the wake of Brackeen, ICWA 2050 is a commitment to one generation of work to change the trajectory of generations of Native children. There is no fixed agenda that can address the interwoven and multifaceted systems we aim to change, from funding to policy to courts, and changing popular narratives that have done real harm to Native communities and families. Leaning into this generational time frame, ICWA 2050 intentionally names goals, but not specifically how we will arrive there. It's a commitment to being nimble in response to evolving opportunities, adjusting strategies, and learning together. ICWA 2050 represents three principles. First, to protect the safety, well-being, and spiritual strength of current and future generations of Native families. Second, to preserve ICWA as the gold standard of child welfare policy and to bolster inherent tribal sovereignty. And third, to progress and strengthen ICWA to move beyond the status quo to expand tribal capacity and funding in service to tribal self-determination. While ICWA 2050 won't supplant or detract from regional and local tribal priorities, we're sharing it as an organizing framework that our partners at all levels can use to situate their own work within and to help us recognize opportunities for leverage and for collaboration. Next year, we'll convene tribal nations and intertribal organizations to help us complete an environmental scan of what tribal nations are already doing in these areas and to identify tribes and organizations that want to help us lead this work going forward. In our initial 3-year operating plan, there will be opportunities for every tribal nation, sister organization, non-Native ally, and individual advocate to participate, whatever their current capacity. We'll also develop mechanisms to report back on our progress to tribal leadership and to Indian country to ensure transparency and accountability. Finally, you can play a role too. We need more warriors to serve Native families and children in our communities and to fight to defend ICWA. You can consider a career in social work, law, or both. You can be a foster parent. You can be an extended family or community member who is part of the natural, nurturing network that keeps kids safe. You can follow NICWA and the Protect ICWA campaign on social media to keep up with our work and to figure out what role you want to play. It takes all of us. Together, we can accomplish things that none of us can do alone. Koyana.
We're gonna have a quick panel session to just go over a couple of questions, but if anybody has any burning questions they want to ask right now, I want to give you guys the opportunity for that real quick. Okay. Thank you both for those talks. I really appreciate your discussion and just some of the work that you guys have done and are involved with and plan on doing here in the future. And just really, I think the way that you have spoken, both of you have been really from the heart about some of the work that obviously has a lot of meaning for the both of you. And just thinking about that, I'm kind of going off of the questions that I have here. What are some of your personal goals for the tribal child welfare and thinking about some of the work that you have for your future? What are some of your own personal goals in that field?
Well, can everyone hear me? Excellent. All right. Personal goals. So just recently, our team was awarded a new project, as I mentioned, the National Tribal Child Welfare Center for Innovation and Advancement. It is a lengthy title. But in us beginning to lead this work, I am very much looking forward to the opportunity to connect directly with tribal child welfare programs nationally and be able to look at the incredible work that these programs are doing and highlight it in a better way than I think that we have in the past. Our project, like I mentioned, we were previously doing very similar work with the Center for Tribes. And I think we can do such a better job of really highlighting like our prevention programs that are throughout our tribal child welfare programs across the nation. Is so much incredible work going on that is just, it's kind of under the surface. And if we can highlight that a little bit more, I think we can really support programs in building off of what others have done and having new ideas generated. So that's just one goal, but I'm really excited to be able to connect on a deeper level with programs across the country and celebrate them with folks.
Well, one immediate goal I have is in the next 2 months to work to get a bill through the Senate. So in September, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 9076, which is a bill to reauthorize Title 4B of the Social Security Act. So that's a law that provides funding for several tribal child welfare programs. And reauthorization is overdue. So Congress was already supposed to have done this, and they haven't yet. And we have a short window left, just a few days left in this legislative session to try to get this through. And this bill would be incredibly impactful for tribal communities in particular. So while it would reauthorize funding for states as well, for all of the grantees who receive Title 4B funding, it would increase the amount of funding for tribal nations, increase a set aside for them, which would allow more tribes to get funded and tribes to also receive larger grants. So some of the tribes are literally receiving like $10,000 grants. So what on earth are you going to do with $10,000? It's so inadequate. So increasing the grant amount, funding more tribes. By our back of the envelope estimates, close to 400 of the 574 tribes could potentially receive funding if we up the amount like it's in the legislation. This bill would also reduce some of the administrative burden. So even tribes who are receiving those tiny $10,000 grants have to do all of the same crazy reporting that states who get millions of dollars in grants receive. So it's really important to make the administrative paperwork line up with the amount of the grant that you're getting. So reducing administrative burden is really a big deal. So if we can get this legislation onto the Senate floor and get it through the Senate by the end of this calendar year, that will be amazing. And if we can't get it through, we have to start all over again in a new congressional session. So the window of opportunity is short. The impact is potentially huge. Senator Wyden, who chairs the Senate Finance Committee, is on board, and we've been working with tribal nations from across the country to reach out to their senators to encourage them. Now is the time to push. So we'll see if we can get this through.
Wow, your goals sound exciting and fun and a lot of work at the same time. And just thinking about everything you are talking about, like there's this federal work that's going, there's this tribal work that's going on, there's this state work that's going on. There's a lot of levels that are involved in all of this. And I say, what are some of your biggest struggles that you've experienced with state and federal agencies engaging with tribes?
Two things come to mind. First of all, the federal government is massive, and there are lots of folks working for federal agencies in Washington, D.C., and then there are also lots of federal employees who are out working in the regions. And so this is just a massive workforce. And many many federal employees have very little knowledge about Native people, tribal communities. There's little awareness of tribal sovereignty and what it means to engage with a nation, what the government to government relationship looks like, what the protocols should be. So I think that's a really huge barrier. And secondly, I would say the federal government's responsibility is to consult with tribes before making policy. And the federal government, although it has improved in recent years, the federal government largely still struggles to figure out what that looks like. By now, most federal agencies, including the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of the Interior, they have consultation policies in place, but they struggle to follow them often. And in my view, that starts with engaging tribal leaders and tribal child welfare directors at the stage of trying to figure out what the problem is. So before they think they know the solution, to actually go talk to tribal people, to talk to tribal leaders about what is the problem, how do you experience it, how would you describe it, what are the solutions, and so really engaging tribes on the front end before they come to the table with half-baked solutions and expect a rubber stamp.
I agree with that. And I want to add that when we're thinking about work with states as well, each state has a different relationship with the tribes in that state, within that geographic region. And some of those relationships are really positive, and there are meaningful connections built, and there is strong work being done. A lot of times, there is a lot of turnover in these positions, one. Two, we have folks that I mentioned a little bit in my presentation, but I think there's sometimes this sense of fear of I'm going to say or do the wrong thing. And I have seen folks not engage because of that, of, well, we'll just kind of wait until the tribe comes to us. And I think one of the biggest opportunities is for state and federal staff and workers and leaders to listen and to to hear from and open that space for tribal leaders and tribal child welfare leaders to come in and talk, like Sarah was saying, figure out the problem early on and start talking. But oftentimes what I have seen is tribal staff being talked to versus being listened to. So it's a very small thing, but I think it's a very powerful thing to keep our ears open and our mouth shut sometimes in those spaces. And I think also building those spaces too, like creating them is really important. One of the goals of our center's work is tribal state relationship building. And so making those spaces and finding those places where we can work with folks to connect them and to heal and to allow our federal and state staff who maybe don't know the history to hear it. And to understand the current context as well.
Well, that's great. And you had mentioned there this part of like, let's provide this opportunity to listen. And I think that's really something that is needed and not just being talked to. And just thinking about that, you can add to that if you'd like to, but what are some of the other process of that relationship building between your organizations, state and federal agencies and tribal agencies? What does that process look like for you as far as that communication relationship building?
So we have relationships with a lot of federal agencies and with many state governments also. I think unsurprisingly, the relationships vary in different places, like Sarah was just saying. In some places, we're invited to help facilitate state engagement with tribes. Like the state wants to talk to the tribes, and they're, as Sarah was just saying, nervous about doing the wrong thing. And so how do we invite the tribe? Who do we invite? What should we do at the first meeting? So we often consult with states to help them think about how to respectfully engage tribes. We also help with state legislation. So during the Brackeen case, a number of state legislatures put forward bills that would codify the Indian Child Welfare Act at the state level. And so 17 states have some form of ICWA legislation right now, but in many places where states were trying to figure out what should we put into state law, how similar or different should it be from the federal law, what other ways do we want to use our authority? Because the federal law is always the floor, not the ceiling. So states can always do more than what the federal law requires. Federal law are minimum standards. So really helping states to think about that. Over the years, we've contracted with several states to develop ICWA training for state caseworkers, and in a number of states facilitated that training, which often included being in a tribal community to deliver the training and then having some kind of community experience in the context of the training. So I would say there's a variety of ways those relationships take shape. But I think one of the important principles about building the relationship, which is what I hear you asking about, is the idea that, I really think about the concept of a durable relationship. And to me, that means something that's going to extend over time. There may be some bumps along the way. We may make some mistakes and skin our knees, but is there enough in that relationship? Is there enough trust? Is there enough desire that we can work together to make the kinds of changes that families and kids really need? Do we believe that enough that we're going to keep coming back to the table? And so I often try to start building a relationship by saying that to people, like, my goal is to have a durable relationship. That means acknowledging that we're both likely to make mistakes in this relationship. And when we do that, I hope that we have enough trust to recognize that this was an unintentional mistake and we can talk about it. and we can figure out how to not make the same mistakes again. So I think just that even the concept of like a durable relationship and an acknowledgement that we're both likely to mess some things up along the way. And I want somebody to tell me so that I don't keep doing the same things wrong. But if we have that kind of understanding at the beginning, that often allows enough space for the work it takes over time to build a meaningful relationship.
I agree that I think the two words that I think of when we think about our relationship building would be slow and intentional. I think slow in the sense that it doesn't necessarily always happen at a snail's pace, but really not trying to rush through things. So often I see in this work, especially, there's a sense of urgency. We know that children are at stake, and we all want to get things done. And sometimes I think we tend to kind of push through in those beginning phases of building a relationship with different organizations and different federal and state partners because we want to get to that end goal of we know that there's something that needs to be done, but taking some time to learn about who you are working with, learn about what they're passionate about, find those connections. I have found that to be really powerful in maintaining those long-lasting relationships that if there is a mistake, like Sarah said, that trust is there so you can step back and say, all right, we are here for this intentional reason. Let's continue to move forward and work on that goal.
Thank you for that. And you guys obviously speak from a level of experience and knowledge and being in this field. What would you say to somebody who doesn't have that experience and knowledge in this field and that new social worker that's going out there? What kind of recommendations would you have for that individual who's just starting out and wanting to move into this area?
I think there's a lot of things. First thing that comes to mind is having a strong network is going to help you in so many ways in tribal child welfare and in tribal social work in general. This is a very small field, and you will meet the same people time and time again. And building relationships with those folks, just as much as building relationships with the state, federal, and tribal partners, that is just as critical in my mind. Having those folks, especially too, as you're getting into the field, that you can talk to comfortably about what's going on. Like I said, you'll experience things and see things and hear things and that you weren't prepared for. It's just how this field is. And I feel so much that if you have that support network of your own, it will go so much further in being able to really support you in your career journey and staying in this field without that burnout. And also recognize if you do get burnt out, taking that time to take care of yourself and that you can potentially bounce back. I left this field for a while, a couple years ago, and I went and worked at Crumble Cookies for 2 months when I took some time off. And then I was doing some consulting and I went back, but I needed a break. And for me, I had this little dream in the back of my head of maybe someday I'll open a bakery. So I'll go work at a cookie shop and get some experience while I do some consulting. But I share that just as an aside, as if it gets too difficult, take some time away and then come back. I There's so much need in this field. There are so many positions and there's so much turnover. And the more passionate and healthy people that we have doing this work, the better outcomes we will have for children. So just a message to take care of yourself in this work too.
I'd like to embroider on top of that. I think what Sarah just said is really important. And part of what I think about is some advice that a very experienced Native social worker gave me when I was starting, that was about taking care of ourselves and the people around us. And one of the things that she said is, you need to think about the daily practices that you have that help you to stay in balance. So whatever those things are that you attend to every day, to show up in your work in a grounded and resilient place, to be able to keep doing hard work. It's important to have those daily practices. But she also said, there are times that the work is much harder, and it will take more than just your daily practice to sustain you. So sometimes the things that you're doing, the things that you're exposed to, require what she called a deep reserve. You've got to have somewhere else to pull from, something far greater than whatever your daily practice is. So she said, you have to figure out what those things are, and you have to be able to be disciplined about making sure you do those things, to do your daily practice, but also to think about, what are the other things that feed me? What are the things that I need to do in my life so that I can have that reserve when I have to call upon it? So my community in the late summer every year has a 2.5-day women's wellness retreat, where women of all generations get together and have some time together. And I do everything I can to be there, because that's one of the things that feeds me. So being really conscious of what are the things that I need to do in order to make sure I'm doing my daily practices, in order to make sure I have some reserve to call on when I need it, have been really important to me.
Yes, wellness is such a great thing, and taking care of yourself. And cookies are a great thing as well, too. Baking is definitely a part of our household, especially coming up in the season. That's great. If you think about schools of social work and public health, and recommendations do you have for schools of social work and public health in preparing new social workers going out into this field, or what are some needs that are there?
I think one thing that's already happening is practicum experiences in other organizations, and stepping away from the university and from the city that you're going to school if possible. And I also feel that getting as many opportunities in front of students for them to be exposed to what is really happening in programs, whether that's having a program come and present, and maybe having students work on a piece of work for them, or learn about different child welfare programs. I think there's a lot of different ways that schools of social work and public health can connect what is happening day to day with school and with education. Some of my most memorable experiences in this program were those experiences where, for example, we had one class with organizations where we did a project with the Blind Center locally, and I still have contacts from that project that I still talk to those folks. And that was a long time ago. And when I think about those things, those are what really enriched my experience as a student, was being able to say I effectively did something that supported an organization. It could have been a very, very small thing, but it was a lot more tangible to me than reading a book, writing a report, but feeling like I did something that maybe I can do that at another organization when I leave here, and maybe I can do it a little bit different. And so, yeah, just building inspiration through building those connections and doing meaningful work.
I'm thinking about Native-specific coursework. So the reason that I came to this program was because there were dedicated classes about working with Native communities and Native clients, about American Indian Alaska Native social welfare policy. So that was a huge draw for me. But I think from a program standpoint, it's just as important to integrate content about Native communities and serving Native families in all of the other coursework. So what's the opportunity to integrate some of this content in other policy classes, in other social work practice classes, community development, research? How can we make sure that you get Native content not just to the people who are intentionally choosing Native coursework, but that throughout the experience of their program, that all social work students, all public health students have the opportunity to be exposed to some of these things, including knowing where to find resources to learn more about them.
Yeah, that's great. I plug for the Brown School of Social Work here. We have a Native American concentration to help prepare some of our students to go out into the field and have some of that background there. And thinking about that and that like specific curriculum training, I think that's very needed in this field and anybody going to work with tribal communities for sure. Thinking about the workforce that's out there and the child tribal welfare that's out there, what kind of training needs do you think that is needed in that field and in that community? What are some of the needs that are out there?
This is a tricky question, in my opinion, because we're thinking about many, many hundreds of tribal child welfare programs, right? So each tribe can have their own program as a sovereign nation, and every program is vastly different. There are many similarities that we can probably observe through the programs, but largely each program has its own nuances. There are some programs, like Sarah said, that receive $10,000 in reimbursement for a piece of their work, and there are others that are in the millions. And that really vastly changes how we look at the workforce from program to program. But I think something consistently that I see is a need for a model of training of basic tribal child welfare core competencies, maybe for lack of a better word, but having something that can be shared with folks. I don't know if it's a virtual training. Our organization has done in-person trainings where we've gone to different tribes. We've sat down with their entire workforce in their child welfare program. Sometimes they invite in behavioral health staff and staff from their court systems or other programs. But we have found that to be really successful when we can go in and sit directly with a tribal program for a couple days and do a deep dive into their program and talking through some of those core areas of how to make an assessment and what does ICWA look like and what does that mean for a tribal program, recognizing that ICWA is very much a law that impacts states. And so what is the tribe's role? How are they responding and thinking about ICWA? And so largely, I would say looking at having a more robust training and recognizing that every tribe is going to have an individual need within that training. So how can they individualize that to be reflective of their culture and their values in their program?
Workforce training is a big part of what we do. We have more than 30 training curricula. The first one that we wrote in the mid-'80s is called Heritage in Helping, and we think of that as like an introduction to tribal child welfare. So that's a curriculum that deals with assessment, case planning, documentation, like what do you keep in your case files, writing court reports and testifying in court, like a whole range of things. So it's a pretty extensive curriculum. We piloted a one-day virtual version of that in late September, and capped the course at, I think, 90 people. But we had 90 tribal and First Nations child welfare workers from Canada also, who tuned in for a day of virtual training about this Heritage and Helping curriculum. So obviously a very short excerpt. We called it Foundations of Tribal Child Welfare Casework Practice, I think. And Tara Raynon, who is our senior program director, who has more than 25 years of experience with tribal child welfare programs, including her own community, was the trainer there. But we have curriculum that addresses working with substance abusing families. That's one of the major topics that we hear about a need for some training around. We have a positive Indian parenting curriculum. This is probably our best known and most popular curriculum. We train it as a train the trainer format. So this is a training for parents. So we're training the trainers who will go on to train parents in their community. And it's a totally customizable training. So the intent is really that people will take the topics and integrate their local context and culture into this kind of national framework. But that training has been very popular, and we're in the process now of gathering evidence of effectiveness to get this entered into the registry for prevention programs, approved prevention programs. So I think the need for training is substantial. We hear about it all the time. We recently partnered with an organization that was looking at training needs in Alaska. So 229 of the 574 federally recognized tribes are in Alaska. So about 40% of tribes, federally recognized tribes, are in Alaska. And we were trying to gather some data there about what kind of training are workers getting and how much training and what topics and who are the trainers. And what we found is that the vast majority of workers had less than 8 hours of training a year. And for folks that were getting any kind of training, the majority of the training that they had access to was actually access to the state training, which most tribes feel like is helpful, that we know how to talk their talk. We understand their language and their like philosophy about cases and the forms that they're using, but that's not how we want to do child welfare. So state training is helpful when you have a relationship with the state and you're trying to figure out how to co-case manage cases. But in terms of tribes having access to training for how they want to run their services, that's really woefully inadequate. So training is a huge issue.
So that very well ties into my next question. What are some like the biggest barriers that you might see as far as training some of our workforce and maybe even training some of our tribal colleges, universities, and how that could be a potential benefit for some of that workforce as well?
I think one of the barriers is time. When we think about our tribal caseworkers and workforce, oftentimes they are understaffed. They may have court. They may have a number of other things that prohibit them from doing any type of training that would be like a 2, 3, 4-day training where you send someone. One of the trainings that our organization did is we brought together 4 different tribes in Nebraska, in Kansas, and we brought them together for 3 days, and we had 75 folks attend. And during those 3 days, the door was just in, out, nonstop. And it's hard to watch as someone who is supporting the facilitation of the training, because you know every one of those calls is related to a child or an outcome, or it's critical. And we also know the content that's happening in the room is what these programs are asking for. And so it gets really difficult to balance, how do we find the time to effectively train our tribal workforce when they are so overworked? And when day one, sometimes folks are coming in and they're getting handed a stack of cases, and the training they're getting is walking around the office with a coworker or a supervisor. And that, I think there's a lot of opportunity in how we look at things as we're going into a more virtual space with some trainings. It's not always, in my opinion, in person is always best for relationship building, for just retention of information. But if we can find those micro opportunities to do training, getting webinars out there, getting folks starting to do little pieces, then we can build, I think, their skill and be able to support our workers in a small micro way where hopefully we can get that deeper training too. So.
Gosh, I really agree that time is the huge issue. I was out at Navajo Nation last month and was talking to the workers there who work with the state of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah on ICWA cases. And these ladies had caseloads of 70 cases. And that is just wild. So how do you ever find time for training when you've got a caseload like that? I also think that Sarah's point about the format of training is a big question for us. You know, a lot of the training that we were doing before the pandemic was all in person. We were doing training institutes, which for us means we train on a certain topic and tribes from across the country come. And so there's a diverse group of people who are at the training. And then we also go directly to communities and train a critical mass of people within a particular community. Sometimes that looks like training tribal and state workers together. Sometimes that's training a couple of workers from neighboring tribes. Sometimes that's just one community. But we had been very reticent to do virtual training before the pandemic. And that we felt like the subject matter is too sensitive. We want to make sure that when we're talking about difficult things, we can tell how it's landing on people. We want to be able to provide support in the moment if people need help. Like, we just felt for all kinds of reasons like virtual training was not going to cut it. And then during the pandemic, we didn't have a choice. And a couple of things happened. One is that there was a period of time where workers were not seeing clients. And so suddenly they had time. They had time for training. They had time to be doing other things because they weren't actually spending time with clients. So we scrambled to start trying to convert some of the trainings that we were doing in person to virtual trainings. And so, so we learned that some of the things that we felt like were not appropriate to do virtually, that actually you can. And we learned how to do things like pray with people virtually, like help people deal with trauma in the moment in a virtual way. Like all of the things that we do in in-person trainings, we learned, I guess you can do some of those things virtually. We still hear overwhelmingly that people prefer to be in person, that it's a much more meaningful experience. But when people are trying to gain some new information or understand something about an emerging topic or start to think about how to build a new skill or even find other people who are struggling with the same thing, like even that networking function, that relationship building function that's so effective in person, some of that can still happen virtually. And we hear regularly the number one thing that tribes want is to learn from other tribes. They really want to have that peer learning experience of being able to ask another tribe, how did you do it? What funding source? What got in the way? How did you convince your tribal council? How did you develop a relationship with the state? Like that ability to learn very detailed information about implementation has been highly valued.
Yeah, that's great. I wish I could ask you all the rest of my questions I have here, but I do want to give a few minutes to anybody here in the audience that may have a question that's on their mind. No questions. I see people thinking, but nothing's coming out, so.
I'm wondering about what I tell my students every semester is there are not enough Native people, Native workers to go and do the work. And I always encourage them to, not box yourself out. It's not just Native people that can help Native people. Do you think that that's why there is such a shortage in the workforce? I mean, have you? Do you think that's something that is like a theme out there that maybe non-Native people are hesitant to go work with Native people or children specifically around ICWA?
I think the shortage of workers is for a number of reasons. As a person who did not grow up in my community and who has never worked for a tribe, I will say that I think working for your own community is really hard. And so I think some Native people go home and work for their community and serve their relatives, and that can be incredibly difficult work. And some Native people choose to work for other tribes, even sister tribes. But what I'm hearing from tribes across the country now is generationally, there is a workforce that is retiring, and that the folks who are retiring are looking around them and trying to figure out where the next worker's coming from. And what at least some communities have said to me is, I've had older workers say, I remember when I was introduced to this field, and I think about the people in my community who showed me what this work is and who talked to me about how our Native values align with this kind of work, how being of service to our community is something we can do in this way, even if it's hard work, and who helped me to build a network that made it possible for me to do this work for decades to serve my community. And I don't think people are being introduced to the field in that way anymore. I don't think people are being invited into this work. And as the larger debate about child welfare reform has heated up, I think that has repercussions not just in state systems, where states are also struggling to find enough workers to do this job, but I think at the tribal level too. And something that gives me real hope for both more Native social workers and non-Native allies to have the opportunity to work with Native communities is that many tribes are going through a process to decolonize their programs. So when tribes first had the opportunity to build services for kids and families to develop programs, they looked around them, and the vast majority of tribes developed systems and programs that looked like what the states were already doing, because that's what the funding source supported, and those were the services and programs that were considered quote unquote legitimate. They looked a particular way, they acted in a particular way. So most tribes mirrored those services when they were developing their own. And what I see now is handfuls of tribes are stepping back to say, we created programs that mimicked the programs that never served our kids and families well, and we have the opportunity to do it differently. And they're going through the hard process of refounding their program, going back to the ways of helping people that our communities had traditionally, and not trying to just implement those things now, but to say, how does this apply in a contemporary context? And what does this mean about the relationships we should have with families? And what does that mean about what our job descriptions should say and what our job titles are? And what does that mean about the kind of funding we need to do these services? So I think the moment in time that we're at now, where tribes are really refounding their programs, is a real opportunity for more Native people to see the work as being values aligned. Yes, this is work that I want to do in service to my community or other Native communities. And I think it's an opportunity for non-Native people who want to work with Native communities to be able to do work in a different way than is currently done in most states and counties.
I don't know if I have too much more to add to that. That was a great response.
That's fine. I agree. I wouldn't add anything to that either. Well, I just want to say appreciate both of you being here and the work that you've done, the work that you're doing, and the work that you're going to continue to do. I think it's really amazing, and we appreciate that. I think we all appreciate that, and our children and their children definitely appreciate that too as well. And in that appreciation, we do have a couple of gifts we wanted to give to each of you, just to thank you, not just for your time, but for the work that you do as well. They're locked in their seats, though. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you all out there in Zoom land and here in person for your time. And if anybody out there has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And I don't know if I ever gave my name, but my name is Manasseh Begay, and I am faculty here at WashU as well. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.